Welcome, everyone. It's very nice to have you here. I'm going to not say anything and turn it over directly to Dean Shiblet.
That's a job I want. Bring them in order and then I'll come. I'm just going to say welcome. It's a wonderful turnout and thank you for being here. Thank you also to the Martin House for hosting us. It's a terrific venue and we're proud of our partnership with the Martin House Restoration Corporation. And we're even more proud of what this place and its relationship to that historic treasure has done for this community, this city, and this region. I also want to thank the Humanities Institute for co-sponsoring this with us. It's a part of a continuing kind of Banham fellowship conversation that we've enjoyed for now well over a decade. And also, of course, special thanks to our guest speakers who will become well known to you through the course of the afternoon. The Aesthetics of Citizenship. What a title. I mean, it's so provocative. It's so full of things I want to talk about. And then I read the paragraph that followed and I got scared. Because if you read that paragraph, you heard things like, what does taxation in the built environment look like? What does taxation in the built environment look like? There's something kind of victim undertow in that. As if we aren't the architects of our own taxation system. As if we couldn't make such a system part of the media with which we paint our world. But what does taxation look like in the built environment? And that's followed with even more scary expressions like, how do those aesthetic qualities influence the way the public understands their role as tax provider, voter, public space user? Again, an undertow of victim as opposed to active creator of role, of constraints and opportunities in provision as a public space maker, not just user. And how we elevate ourselves past that victim status. My scholarship for now 40 years has been devoted to a kind of understanding the theoretical foundations of what we have come to call placemaking. This challenges the basic assumptions of the aims of our practice in architecture, in planning, in landscape architecture, in housekeeping. And it suggests that there's a common strain across those and many other practices that paint our world, that have aims that are beyond the artifacts we make, manage, and maintain. But they are never inconsequential artifacts. They're part of the core of who we are and what we do. These aims of practice are about the relationships we construct in our work. And those relationships are also media. Taxing forms relationships. Real estate forms relationships. Transportation systems construct the possibilities of relationship. The relationships I'm most interested in, and that I'm eager to hear debated and discussed, are those relationships between ourselves and the places we come to call home, at whatever scale you would frame home. And inevitably, the aim of practice is to establish the conditions where we love where we are, and that love's okay. It's maybe not the most scholarly expression of what we do, but if you don't love home in all of its various dimensions, what are we trying to do here? Well, we want to critique home. Amen. A home that can't stand critique isn't much of a home. So all of those things are there. So aim of practice, people to place, for sure. A second aim of practice is people to people in place. That is, the making, managing, and maintaining of this home we might come to love creates social networks and relationships among ourselves, which are part of, there's that word, citizenship. How do we relate to one another in the practice of making and maintaining our home? How do we regulate and guide our actions? All of this is a provocative assumption or assertion, perhaps, in the aesthetics of citizenship. It's interesting to me that tax policy as media is not thick volumes in our library when you think about the media of making place. And it tends to get reduced. You will hear later today from Christina Orsi, who's been in the thick of work in our Regional Economic Development Council and in our Buffalo Billion Investment Program. We have brought some of the best minds in the world to Buffalo to work with us in understanding our economic sectors, how to grow an economy that might have some chance of actually affecting those most in need as we elevate all of us in the kind of economic conditions of our region. These folks have reduced the aesthetics of citizenship to something I would call spatial efficiency. And when you think about how dry and dead that idea is compared to what we aspire to in making places we can come to love, we have to kind of push ourselves beyond that. But the idea behind an economic plan that becomes part of what we paint with is at the central core of making this region a region we can come to love. I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts that came to us as we were translating our research and work in placemaking into Spanish. And I'm a terrible Spanish speaker, it's really tough for me, but in the course of looking for the right words for different ideas, a word from the Spanish bullfight came forward. And I'm going to say it badly, so those of you who speak Spanish well can correct me afterward. But the word is querencia. That's the place the bull in the fight retreats to, regroups, gathers, and prepares to engage again. That's the place the bull discovers. That's the place citizens make and remake all the time. They seek that site of querencia. I'll conclude with the notion that John Dewey said it best, perhaps, when we're thinking about citizenship and aesthetics. He suggested the primary problem, or might suggest opportunity, of the public is how it constitutes itself. Constitutes, makes, think media, make the public, make the place. And all of the things that you'll hear and talk about today will deal with that family of things. This is both the opportunity and the challenge of the aesthetics of citizenship. Welcome to our symposium. I'm going to turn it back to folks who now will introduce the subject matter more clearly. Thank you.
So, hi, my name is Omar. I'm the chair of the Department of Architecture. I'm here just to sort of introduce the Banham Fellowship and what makes this symposium possible. Jordan Carver is our 15th Banham Fellow. The Banham Fellowship is in celebration of Peter Reyner Banham's legacy here in Buffalo. He taught at UB from 1976 to 1980. And the kind of critical engagement, experimental engagement that Banham demonstrated in his scholarship is what we're looking for in an up-and-coming fellow. Jordan's proposal for the fellowship was to explore the relationship between state funding, public infrastructure, and civic identity, which aligns strongly with the department's which is our focus right now in terms of being part of a public university. We're one of only 2 accredited programs that are part of a university in New York State. And our own interest in terms of what constitutes the public and the public representation in our built environment. His proposal was so enticing and exciting, and we're really happy to have him here. Jordan has been teaching in the sophomore year, as well as running a seminar, a year-long seminar that's dealing with the aesthetics of citizenship. Jordan is an architectural writer and a researcher and a very good educator. He's the managing editor was the managing editor of GSAPD books at Columbia University, and is currently the co-organizer of Who Builds Your Architecture, which is an advocacy group working on globalization and labor. His essays have been published in a variety of magazines and journals, and he is a graduate of the MArch and the Master of Critical, Curatorial, and Conceptual Practices in Architecture, both from Columbia University. So with that, I'd like to introduce Jordan Carver.
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's event, noted as the Aesthetics of Citizenship. But before we get started, I want to recognize just a couple people who has worked very hard to make this day possible. Of course, Dean Shibley and Omar and Jordan Geiger have been super, super helpful. But not to mention the entire UB community and their enthusiasm for this event and their really incredible support of me and my research and the Reyner Banham Fellowship. And I'd echo Bob's thanks to Eric Seaman at the Humanities Institute for their support, and to Mary Roberts, Susanna Tejada, and Monica Stage here at the Darwin Martin for their willingness to house us at this really, really incredible landmark. A huge thank you to all our participants, both local and those who fought the weather to be here. I'm honored, really, really honored to convene an event where I get free reign to invite anyone I wanted. And that was true, I could invite anyone I wanted. And I'm really honored and humbled that so many of you chose to accept. And lastly, thanks to the students who I've worked with over the year. It's been a very difficult set of questions and design challenges and research prompts, and it has not always been very clear. So, today's event is billed as a symposium, and it is proposed as such, much like the Socratic sense, as a robust debate and discussion amongst interested and sometimes dissimilar parties, including those joining us in the audience. And feel free to shout things or ask questions or interlope whenever you may feel so. So my role here is a bit like Glaucon, an interlocutor and myself who asks occasionally naive, yet hopefully pointed questions. The day is structured as a series of presentations and conversations. So the day is structured as a series of presentations and conversations that bring together architects, artists, historians, and public servants to discuss the complex relationships between state-sponsored projects and services, what we might call very broadly infrastructures, or even more broadly public space, mechanisms of public finance, i.e. taxation, and conceptions of citizenship and political agency, or how these things affect political ideology and vice versa. This project is centered around two questions I've asked the presenters in advance and do so again. What are the aesthetic qualities of government spending, and how do they, in turn, affect how people identify their role as taxpayer and citizen? The academic terms here might belie a straightforward intent. By the public, I wish to understand it as both a multifarious construction and also as a more clearly defined group of subjects under the power of a sovereign state, a more or less classic definition of the public. This would be both citizen, legally designated, but also those who both participate in the functioning of a state or fall within its jurisdictional boundaries, regardless of their legal standing. Public space, to put quotes around that, too can be understood in this way. And while there exist tax subsidies, utilities, mortgage products, public-private partnerships, and other systems that serve to scramble the didactic division between public and private space, quite often to the point where these two designations prove completely useless. Here, I'm interested in questioning the space created through direct budgetary outlays, political rhetoric, and state-backed institutions, what I might call first-order design, planning, and development schemes of the state. These questions are what has driven my research here in Buffalo, and ones that I will hope will make for an engaging afternoon. This event marks the point just past midway in a year-long research initiative. And so, as an introduction to the day, I'd like to present two threads or vignettes that, as the project progresses and with the efforts of today's participants, will begin to compose some answers to today's defining questions, or at the very least, help create some better questions. So the first I'm calling Space and Sovereignty, or a welfare queen in a cowboy hat. So this project began, at least in spirit, in mid-March of last year, not here in Buffalo, but in the desert southwest of Nevada, when the 20-year standoff between Cliven Bundy, renegade cattle rancher, and the ideological views of Sean Hannity, and the federal government exploded into the media spectacle that in many ways perfectly crystallized the current political landscape of this country. I think when Dean Shibley mentioned the media of taxation, this is one example. For decades, Bundy had let his small herd of cattle graze on federal land managed by the Bureau of Land Management, or BLM. By all accounts, the grazing fees for federal lands are far below market rate, yet Bundy refused to pay. His rationale was an ad hoc mix of right-wing ideology, denying the legitimacy of the federal government, a questionable claim to familial land, and a rather nuanced view of states' rights. Even after many failed lawsuits and court cases, Bundy steadfastly refused to acknowledge either the authority of the BLM or the sovereignty of the federal government. In late March, this culminated in the Bureau attempting to seize Bundy's herd, about 900 cattle or so, and forcibly remove them from federal lands. Riding the strong sentiment of riding the strong tide of anti-Obama sentiment, Bundy took his cause to the media. Bundy painted himself as a simple rancher being unfairly targeted by an oppressive federal government, a story that appealed to both right-wing militia groups sprinkled throughout the West and the Fox News base. The result was an armed standoff between self-appointed Bundy supporters and various federal law enforcement agencies, including the BLM, the Forest Service, and the FBI. Not wanting a violent confrontation and fearing the safety of its rangers, who are not law enforcement officials, the government called off the seizure. Basically, Bundy won. The reaction from the left was just as vehement as his support from the right. The cast of MSNBC, among other opinion makers, were quick to write off Bundy as a member of the lunatic fringe. Others christened him the welfare queen in a cowboy hat, had a nice ring, taking one of Ronald Reagan's most celebrated and factually flimsy anecdote and casting it back on someone squatting on public land and who one can maybe assume might have at least some Reaganite leanings. Bundy ideology is at once comic and tragic, equal parts crotchety get off my damn lawn isolationism and fiercely anti-tax individualism. At its core, the incident highlights how adherence to political ideology, the contest of federal sovereignty, and the benefits of public resources can become mixed up to the point of incoherence. Bundy's failure to recognize the very mechanics of publicly held resources, yet pose it as an American patriot, would be comically hypocritical, lest it not highlight a troubling misunderstanding of basic civics and social cohesiveness that underlies a certain thread of radical politics. This mix of anti-tax yet pro-common good sentiment can be seen across various movements on the political right. It would be too easy to cast it aside as simple ignorance, hypocrisy, or righteous selfishness. And I guess I should kind of caveat all this, that this is really, I'm not interested in looking at this from right and left. I'm looking at the mechanics of how these sort of ideologies are formed. Here in Western New York, a similar, albeit far less vehement sentiment has sprouted in Springville, a small town just south of Buffalo. Rather than armed militias and network news, Hugh Dunn, a longtime resident of Springville, has registered his discontent with the government's incompetence by financing and erecting a sign that at first appears to be protesting the construction of a new Route 219 bridge, but is actually a reference to the fact that the route itself remains incomplete. Route 219, which connects Buffalo with Salamanca, 60 miles to the south, comes to an abrupt end just after the new bridge in question, where all traffic is funneled into a two-lane road. So Dunn would like to see this road completed and has been vocal about his desire for years. The details of his anger and his activism are similar to many tales of government frustration, federal bureaucracy, wasted time, and mismanaged funds. But what I find most salient about this image is not Dunn's sign, but the fact that it's paired with campaign signs for Tom Reed and Rob Astorino, just sort of tucked underneath it. Rob Astorino is a current Westchester County executive and was the 2013 Republican and Conservative Party gubernatorial candidate. His platform was largely comprised of boilerplate conservative talking points, lower taxes, balanced budget, deregulation, and as you probably know, he lost. Tom Reed, on the other hand, won his re-election campaign to maintain his seat representing New York's 23rd district. Among other duties, Reed is a member of the House Committee on Ways and Means, the primary tax writing committee of the House. Yet Reed, contrary to many of his other conservative colleagues, and sometimes very conservative colleagues, has come out against raising the federal gas tax, one of the primary means of funding roads and infrastructures. He prefers instead a tax holiday on corporate profits stashed in offshore tax havens, which is a whole other hornet's nest that we can't really get into today, unfortunately. But what I'm really interested in is the two conflicting representations of political identity. Both instances require a commitment beyond party loyalty. They require action and the staking out of claims within a type of public forum, albeit a minor roadside, but that has in turn garnered the attention of local media and website commentary. That one identity is ostensibly pro-public, and one is professing an ideological loyalty to a person, if not a party, that is more or less against using government power for these very types of expenditures, speaks directly to the type of disconnect I'm interested in parsing out, and one I believe architecture and planning, i.e. the aesthetics of our collective environment, can play a crucial role in influencing. The second thread that I'm going to kind of throw out there, I've called, for the time being at least, being in public, or the appearance of space and its effect on action, and by action I mean politics. So if I can go back to this initial formula for the creation of public space, there appears to be an ideological inconsistency, here marked in these X's, that exists somewhere within this public tax, public space schema. Somewhere along the line, the wires have been crossed. And while the diagram is purposely simplistic, it hopefully serves as both an impossible ideal and a tool for analysis, a map of sorts in which to kind of take these butterflies of discontent and pin them down. What and where then are the breaks, and at what register do we represent them? Is it at the sovereign state level where the authority of the federal government or other governing entity is denied, meaning public space isn't recognized, or one in which the value of public finance is being either mis- or unrepresented or actively ignored? This being a question of value for dollars, kind of waste management. Or is it a disconnect between the expenditure of state treasury and the creation of public goods? This link between funds gathered and funds expended is where I believe architecture, planning, and design can play a role in terms of their function as both aesthetic objects and as representative signs of governance and authority. The discord, or what might be called a kind of noise in this chain of civic feedback, that I'm interested in can be seen in many different registers, and they flow in both directions through the diagram. But I would argue that concrete negativity trumps abstract benefit every time. Potholes, unfinished roads, and crusty subways cannot compete with the abstract reality that somewhere infrastructure is being produced for the benefit of some abstract group of people. Images of public housing inaugurations can in no way compete with their implosions on the collective memory as a symbol of public policy and government action and its effects in the city. I would propose that the problem, the circle that cannot be squared in this instance, is one of being in public. That is to say, the existence of a subject within a defined or constructed public is negated either through means of denial or ideological refusal, or perhaps more succinctly, a condition in which an individual both denies the existence of a public, both as a social enterprise and a spatial condition. The result is a denial of the political process in the traditional democratic sense, and even in the radical agonistic sense, that would be at least less structurally inclined to compromise. Hannah Arendt labels this particular area of concern as the space of appearance, a constructed space, although not necessarily an architectural space, in which the subject can appear in politics, the subject can appear and politics can be performed through speech and action. Arendt's construction of labor, work, and action has been fertile ground for architectural thinking and theorizing as it highlights the material permanence of objects as a result of work and their importance in the realm of politics. This has allowed historians like Kenneth Frampton and George Baird to link the production of architecture and architectural style with the material and political framework that Arendt has established. And although published over 50 years ago, I believe that these ideas still hold value for spatial thinking and the ways in which we relate as political beings. But where Frampton uses Arendt's conception to prioritize the object-making qualities of work, and thereby bolstering the position of the architect, and applies her scheme of labor and work to the suburbanization of America and the preponderance of autocentric planning, the political fallout of such contemporary conditions remains in question. Frampton indicts architecture and planning as complicit in a system that subsumes labor and work within a continual cycle of consumption. But what of the spaces that are actually created, as opposed to their symbolic representation as capitalist consumption? The idealized state of a life free to work is the formation of a polis, quintessentially represented by the construction of a great agora, where speech and action can be performed as political theater at the service of both the state and those who make it. And so, with the absence of such an agora, but with the overwhelming presence of the suburb and the roads and bridges, college campuses, subways, and other great institutions and infrastructures of the state, not to mention the vast contemporary media landscape, which can also be thought of as an infrastructural space, the iPhone, Twitter. Where is the politics, and how can it appear in such space? And importantly, what are the effects of these spaces on such action? And so with that, I would like to introduce our first panel. I'm going to read their very short bios, so I apologize if I'm cutting things out, but they're online, so you can look at them online. And I'm going to read everyone's bio first. Our first guest is Hadas Steiner, who I'm sure you all know, associate professor here at UB, or there at UB. She is the author of Beyond Archigram, The Technology of Circulation, and is currently at work on several manuscripts. One will provide a historical analysis of the evolving use of the term habitat, and by extension ecology in the architectural sense, and another on the photographic documentation conducted by Reyner Banham while he was here in Buffalo. Our second speaker will be Jordan Geiger. He is an assistant professor at UB and a research faculty member at the Center for Architecture and Situated Technologies. His recent article, Niagara, was published by the ARPA Journal, and his edited volume, Interact, is forthcoming from Paul Raven, really forthcoming, almost here. 2 weeks. And joining us via Skype is Keller Easterling, who is an architect and professor at Yale University. She's the author of many, many articles and books, including Enduring Innocence, Global Architecture and Its Political Masquerades, and Organization Space, Landscapes, Highways, and Houses in America. Most recently, she published Extra Statecraft, which was published by Verso last fall, and The Action is the Form, Victor Hugo's TED Talk, was published as an ebook by Strelka Press. So thank you and welcome, and welcome Hadas.
So I heard that the whole sophomore class was coming, so my first image is transitional from our everyday. I guess when Jordan applied for the fellowship and expressed an interest in the state funding of infrastructure, I understood some relationship between what he was proposing and what he asked me to speak about today. So hopefully you'll find it to be somewhat pertinent to understanding the way in which infrastructures and the state-funded infrastructures come into being. But first, just to say that if we're dealing with taxation, after, as I've told many of the participants here today, after the Great Fire of London in 1666, which burned for 5 days and destroyed many, many homes and more than 80 churches, including St. Paul's Cathedral, Christopher Wren was hired to rebuild these churches, and he, in fact, dedicated himself to some 51 churches, including the rebuilding of St. Paul's. And Wren took it as a moment to consolidate an aesthetic, in particular for the Anglican Church, right, as distinct from the Catholic one. In other words, to use it as a moment where the state, in its modern and emerging form, would come up with a way to express itself from an aesthetic point of view. And to do this, Christopher Wren levied a tax on all of the coal that entered the port through the Port of London. So this was one of the early instances of a modern state consolidating through an architectural form a way of expressing itself through, in this case, a religious infrastructure. So from the constitutional monarchy to the welfare state, and the focus on the desire of the welfare state to develop an appropriate kind of housing typology that would reflect the population. This was among the welfare state's earliest concerns in even during World War II, but especially in post-World War II London. And just for your information, by 1955, 74% of the new dwellings that were built in Britain were built by the state. And by 1957, 48% of architects worked for the government. So my role here today is to tell the story of a unique set of circumstances when the intersection of state investment in dire social conditions led to a concerted architectural debate that was the flint against which was sparked the development of an architectural style based, at least in its conception, on an ethical concern. In other words, Jordan asked me if I would speak a little about the Smithsons and the development of the New Brutalism. And this relates, of course, to the topic of Banham and the Banham Fellowship as well, because Banham was the one who defined this style. And as I see it, brutalism was first a socially driven aesthetic before it became basically known as masses of reified concrete. So as is well known, Reyner Banham, with whom the Smithsons defined the New Brutalism, in his reconsideration of this essay, which was published in 1955, asked whether brutalism had succeeded in carrying through an ethical dimension as he had hoped for it earlier, or whether it was just an aesthetic, which for him was a much lesser thing. And in other places, that desire might have had very different resonances of what was considered ethical. But in post-war Britain, which was a place where planning legislation and the direct involvement of the state in reconstruction and in housing, it gave the architect an incredibly prominent role in building the social infrastructure just at the same time as modernism belatedly was assuming a leading role in practice. So there was a conflation of these two things where the architect was becoming politically significant at the same time as modernism was becoming the way to build. And many young architects returned from war service abroad to confront the desolation of post-Blitz conditions. The destruction of the fabric of London is, of course, legendary, and as to be expected, there were numerous governmental reports which addressed various areas of the reconstruction during and after the war. There were, as Nicholas Bullock has written, has described in Building the Post-War World, many, many groups who weighed in on the subject from within the political structure, as well as from without, including citizens groups and the RIBA, the Royal Institute of British Architects. So well before the war had ended, there were already plans that were being laid at the governmental level in the ministries of works and of health, and by the Reconstruction Committee, to name a few of the concerned bodies in the post-war housing drive. In particular, in the context of this symposium, I would like to mention one which was known as the Dudley Committee, which was set up in the spring of 1942, so still during the war, by the Ministry of Health, which began its life as a fairly modest committee that was there to advise on space and equipment standards, but ended up making suggestions that had to do with the internal planning of dwellings. And these were intended to meet the changing patterns of family life. The impact of this committee was very large, and it was felt in the design for housing that was being put up by local authorities, from the arrangements of kitchens and living rooms to the density and proportions of the design for flats and houses. Now, this committee had amongst its members 4 architects, but 2 of them were women, which was very unusual. And they all had been involved in the development of urban housing. But there were also representatives from the women's movement at large, as well as representatives from the medical and sanitary professions, in addition to local government and construction industry figures. So as a result, the report focused not only on types of dwelling, but such as flats or semi-detached houses, terrace houses, etc., but also on how best to arrange the household activities inside of a particular kind of house. And amongst the various treatises on women's work and the poor conditions of working class housing, which was of course the concerted effort towards which this committee was dedicated, the results of a survey of 1,200 households, ranging from households in the center of slums to those in seaside towns, was carried out by the anthropological organization Mass Observation, some of you might know it, and published as a study known as People's Homes. It came out in 1943, and its observations were also taken into account. So incidentally, all the different types of reports that were involved reported that the ideal home as imagined by its occupants was a small house equipped with labor-saving devices and a garden, of course of the type that was really the sort of home that a government would supply to its needy, but nonetheless that was what people desired. Also, new types of standardized construction were developed to speed along the process of providing mass housing in a short period. So thus, many of the returning architects ultimately find themselves work in the busy housing division of the London County Council, otherwise known as the LCC. And from the perspective of the profession, the LCC was seen as producing kind of uninspiring looking housing projects in the immediate post-war years. And it came under a concerted attack for this by J.M. Richards, who was the editor of the Architectural Review for no less than, well, he was the editor from 1937 until 1971. This is a very long, obviously, period of time. And the result of the criticism from the heart of the profession, from the sort of main editor of the architectural publishing, was ultimately that the control over housing design was finally wrested away from the bureaucratic and technocratic arms of the London County Council in 1949 and given to an architect by the name of Robert Matthew and his deputy Leslie Martin, who would later go on to Cambridge with others from the LCC. And the two would also be set up as a team to work on this building, the Royal Festival Hall, which in some ways the architects imagined to represent the aesthetics of citizenship. The Royal Festival Hall can be read through its counterpart, the Festival of Britain, another possible tale, right, where architects were galvanized to develop some sort of a style which represent British character and achievement. These are actually the words that were used. But suddenly, the London County Council, this departmental government, was seen as the place to be. And architects who stood out in school, who did well in school, including at the Architectural Association, like John Killick and Colin St. John Wilson, were attracted to work there. Now, Le Corbusier was a main inspiration for many of these young architects, but there was another source of inspiration that emerged within the LCC, which came from a rather different ideological and aesthetic persuasion, and that was a series of school programs, which was another social program which the government was funding in the post-war years. Among the influences on the architects who worked in that program were social democratic politics of Scandinavian architecture at the time, which came to be known in the architectural community as the New Empiricism. And it was a style that was argued for from the perspective of regionalism that had a very picturesque kind of base, qualities at its base. And these two groups, the Le Corbusier adherents and those who were proponents of New Empiricism, were at odds with each other. They were characterized as the hards and the softs. They were at odds with each other both outside, on the pages of journals and in debates, as well as from within the organization, to be sure. And Reyner Banham wrote about the tensions, these very, very intense tensions in his article, which is called The Revenge of the Picturesque, but also in his book on the New Brutalism, where he wrote that as violent and sustained a polemic on style, such as England had not seen since the 19th century, was brought about by this clash. Now, the Smithsons were not the least of these anti-picturesque campaigners, and it was out of that friction that the New Brutalism as a style was born, the friction between the Corbusian adherents and those who were proponents of the picturesque. But before we get to the heart of that matter, this period, it has been said, was also kind of characterized by an unprecedented professional consensus on what it meant to be an architect. And by this I mean university degrees had only recently become firmly linked to a system of professional accreditation, and architects had, through the governmental system, access to government ministries, local authorities, and corporations. And there were definitely those who made careers out of the demand to fill these housing quotas with the sort of technocratic welfarism of the state on the one hand, and those who saw themselves as providing critical responses within an avant-garde tradition. In the summary of Claire Zimmerman, who's written about these politics, she says the difference between quote-unquote housing and quote-unquote design, experiment and speculation, and everyday calculus of production versus sociology emerged partly from contests within the political and professional matrix. So at the same time as this merging of architectural professionalism and the technocratic, in all-purpose kind of modernism with which it was paired, there arose, largely in reaction to a seeming consensus, this very disaffected or avant-garde group with a disposition that developed their interest in relation to what came to be called architecture without architects. They looked to the vernacular, to what they called the as-found, to the bidonville, or the slum, and even to generic and uninspired housing which was being put up by developers, and certainly the ugly and the ordinary in general. And New Brutalism emerged from this disaffection as exemplified in the architecture of Peter and Alison Smithson, and its emphasis on industrial materials that bore the mark of their construction, and that course on the collapsing of the distance between the building's forms and its functions. And as the Smithsons put it in an essay entitled The Ordinary and the Banal, they said that the architecture of our next step is in pursuit of the ordinary and the banal does not mean that it has lost sight of its objective, ordinariness and banality are the art source of the new situation. So brutalism was born out of two main intellectual streams, an interest in the ordinary, in the ugly, in the banal, and an interrogation of the housing problem, which was, of course, integral in producing a new citizen for what was considered to be the New Britain. Now, the story of how the Smithsons related to the work of the independent group is a well-known story by now. And I also, in other places, have spoken about the relationship of brutalism to the biological and community-based concepts of habitat. But certainly, the aesthetics of brutalism there would be a side to the development of brutalism which emerged from the aesthetics of citizenship, or the aesthetics of what it meant to be a person living in England at this time. And the unité would be the fodder of the aesthetic side of this equation. The younger architects at the LCC promoted the unité d'habitation, Le Corbusier's unité, as a solution for London. But on the other hand, the institutional and financial structure of the local housing authorities for which they worked were firmly kind of stacked against this, because it required reconceiving the housing unit itself as narrow and deep in plan, with double-height living rooms, not to mention those interior streets. In other words, it required a completely different model of the house than had been in use. And indeed, some altered versions of the unité were carried out. This is Bentham Road Estate, which was built in 1953. A team which included Alan Calhoun and Sandy Wilson, for those of you who are familiar. Is Keller here? Hi, Keller. I was just curious all of a sudden because I couldn't see where you were. Hi. And the Alton Estate, West Estate, the form of housing and its social structure was the heart of this problem that the Smithsons addressed with their submission, also for Golden Lane, a competition which they proposed to redevelop a bomb site, essentially, as a housing estate. Their proposal was about the housing of a citizen, in other words, the housing of an individual as a participant in urban and political life. And both at home and in their engagement with CM, which is an organization that you in the audience who are in your sophomore year will be studying about this semester in history. Their engagement with CM, but in both of the realms, the realms of their engagement with the architectural community, the Smithsons seized on the opportunity to kind of articulate their agenda in terms of the problem with contemporary housing solutions that did not reflect in their words any reality of social organization. So since the house itself was the basic unit of urban form, they argued that any insufficiencies at the domestic scale became those of the neighborhood and ultimately the district and then the city. Thus, for a harmonious urbanism to result, the form of the house, which they called the shell which fits on man's back, had to be predicated on the model of the domesticity that it concealed. The Smithsons, for example, granted elevated status to the point of transition between the world of the house and that of the street, as first and foremost the place where children came into contact with others. And this is their presentation grid of the Golden Lane project, and you can see the children playing in the streets there, which was a very unusual way to present an architectural project to the architectural community. And that transition, therefore, required to reflect there on the duality of the home as the place that looked both inward to the family, but crucially also outward, as they said, to society. And relationships, as if one of one of the main categories of their board, relationships between people were everything to them. So the notion that a successful reinvigoration of urban architecture would begin by sort of fostering this meaningful encounter at a threshold of intimacy was grounded itself in an emerging branch of sociological scholarship that analyzed the behavior of children as uncorrupted forms of expression. So looking to places where we could still get the sort of notion of uncorrupted political conditions. And in addition, sociological movements like mass observation, which I mentioned at the beginning, were using techniques that were learned from field biologists to record the sort of everyday activities of people whose energies were mostly directed towards the very, very basic needs of survival. And both of these trends are combined then in these photographs, which were taken by Nigel Henderson, of children playing in the urban streets of slums that took up so much of the presentation board for Golden Lane that the Smithsons took with them to CM9. And these photographs had been taken in tandem with a series of ongoing sociological studies that had been conducted during the 50s and that documented the life of the urban poor in Bethnal Green, a particularly impoverished area of East London. But transported into a presentation here of featuring a low-income housing project, the non-productive activity of play carried out by working-class children was intended to convey this sort of new way of seeing the ordinary, or what they would call in the quality of the as-found, right, in the context of new brutalism. So the as-found itself designated things that partook of reality, a word that the Smithsons kind of applied very liberally to things that they conceived of as genuine, that incorporated crude materiality, found objects, elemental social units, but also types of people, groups of people like laborers, or what they referred to as peasant society. And if this sort of as-found behavior of urban children could kind of be studied for us underlying patterns of associative behavior, the primitive hut itself would no longer be this philosophical abstraction, but instead some sort of key to an architectural code which would produce citizens for the new world. So in the context of the definitive writings on the new brutalism, the significance of the primitive was even more overt. They said, the Smithsons wrote, "What is new about the new brutalism among movements is that it finds its closest affinities not in past architectural style, but in peasant dwelling forms. It has nothing to do with craft. We see architecture as a direct result of a way of life." So it was not meant to be the dexterous manipulation of found materials of a society that defined the practice, but the ability to materially articulate the as-found conditions of being. And the assumption was that the young, the poor, the indigenous, and combinations thereof produced objects more instinctively and therefore were closer to a state of nature. And so when the Smithsons prepared their presentation grill for CM9, known as the Urban Re-Identification Grid, that's the name of this grid, as a kind of demonstration of a particular proposal, its sort of distinctive form came from these social patterns of associations. And this grill, the Smithsons explained to some very puzzled CM participants, is concerned, they wrote, with the problem of identity. It proposes that a community should be built up from a hierarchy of associational elements and tries to express these various levels of association, the house, the street, the district, the city, algebraically. And in the next breath, the Smithsons stressed that the task would be to find, as they said, new equivalents for these forms of association in our new non-demonstrative society. The problem of re-identifying man with his environment, they continued, cannot be achieved by using historical forms of house groupings, streets, squares, greens, as the social reality they represented no longer exists. So not only were the sort of built products of bygone culture ill-suited to the current lifestyle, but they could never foster, the Smithsons believed, any sort of sense of connection for an individual or a society. And in place of the historical repertoire of forms, the Smithsons contended that architects had to do no less than evolve an architecture, these are their words, from the fabric of life itself, an equivalent for the complexity of our way of thought, our passion for the natural world, and our belief in the nobility of man. In a rough and ready way, we have made a start, a doorstep philosophy, an ecological approach to the problem of habitat, a new aesthetic. End of the quote. So if the threshold between the house and the street was facilitating the most instinctive of social activities, from food gathering to play, each successive scalar shift renegotiated the transitions ever more related to the state of culture. And in a diagram related to these associational levels of urban re-identification, to the amount of control that an individual had over one's sense of social connectivity, right? They created this narrative of how a person relates in each historical venue of the city. And as one moved from out of the home, the scene of what they called maximum involuntary associations, towards the larger agglomeration, which was based on social ties, such as the workplace, the level of willed connections increased. And the level of willed connection is, of course, the place of politics. The city was the scene that benefited from the maximum of these voluntary associations, or what they also called an intellectual contact community. In later iterations, as part of the documents that were drafted, Peter Smithson would also include this very famous valley section that more explicitly related the material environmental diagram of association to those of interaction. And in the valley section, there's a historical narrative of architectural development that binds specific milieus to social maturity, from the forest of the hunter to the plains of the urban dweller. And in the Smithson's adaptation, the section becomes this kind of continuum of contemporary urban development, with the least concentrated communities representing a more primitive stage of social evolution than the ultimate community of greater density. So there was a place specificity that demanded also architectural particularity. And the Smithsons would even prepare another grid for the 10th meeting of CM that proposed housing solutions for detached houses, villages, towns, and cities that corresponded with the locations identified on the section, as opposed to the traditional modernist pursuit of ideal prototypes applicable to all situations. And as Banham pointed out in his groundbreaking article on the new brutalism, Golden Lane was a much better demonstration of brutalist philosophy than their other projects, such as on Stanton, despite its incredibly low profile in the architectural press. And Banham built his case for this social argument of Golden Lane on the basis of what he called the aformality of the compositional force over the conventional geometries of architectural design. And this kind of ostensible casualness of aformality, of the kind that would be expressed in a painting by Pollock, for example, was much better understood, according to Banham, in terms of what he called an intuitive sense of topology. And with the analogy between the sort of continuous forms of Golden Lane and the mathematics of an unbroken surface, Banham was really seeking to redirect the debate over brutalism in the specific political terms of the architectural scene, in particular one which he felt had rekindled an interest in classical proportions. But in light of the focus on that topology shared with the doorstep philosophy, on the nuances of kind of qualitative properties, the notion of a kind of instinctive geometria situs turned out to be particularly revealing. So, if Golden Lane began its life as a proposal for a particular site in the City of London, it was also the example that the Smithsonians turned to for this discussion in general of housing that was suited to the densest of urban scales. In the 1954 habitat document that the Smithsonians drafted that focused on the genus of the multiple living unit, the Smithsonians kind of classified housing estates in general according to what they called the taxonomy of quote-unquote culture group United Kingdom and society welfare state. And then they designated an association committed to the, as they put it, leveling down of middle and upper classes and the removal of economic limits to the working class aspirations, both of which led then to the demand for optimum dwelling, i.e. easily worked, satisfying our behavior patterns. So it was determined, therefore, that organization, not style or form, be the foundational, fundamental element for the housing estate, and they named this kind of basic unit the archetypal or the archetypal housing. So at the same time as at the level of the house, organization translated into a set of flexible components, at stake was a much larger claim that though inhabiting the archetypical house, right, embedded with the acronym for urban re-identification, they said, each of us can actively contribute to the total organization of our society. It is a means of achieving order. It recognizes the fact that it is not only a house, but a link in a continuum of occupied space contributing to the dynamics of that space. The type house that is not conceived as a component of community, even a community of one, is no house at all, for the house is inescapably one of the species herb, as the man is of the species Homo sapiens. So there was, as Banham would recognize, a kind of unavoidably aesthetic side to the topology of transition that, and it was on this side that was this side of the equation that would become so deeply embedded in the sort of mainstream practice of brutalism as we have come to know it. As the Smithsonians wrote, the manifestation of the doorstep philosophy came with a new aesthetic, and they called this aesthetic the cluster, which in turn they defined as a close-knit, complicated, often moving aggregation, but an aggregation with a distinct structure. And so the cluster, they thought, was as close as one could come to a description of what they thought of as the new ideal in architecture and planning. In the end, this sort of open-ended pattern of the multi-centered metropolis that resulted from a reproduction of homes, and then neighborhoods, and then districts, was a very bold graphic feature, and they explained, we are after something more complex and less geometric. We are more concerned with flow than with measure. So as ever, they kind of ended up firmly connecting this resultant aesthetic of change to the social ethics of the agenda in the next sentence. And it was with their words in this regard that I will end. They said, we have to create an architecture and a town planning which, through built form, can make meaningful the change, the growth, the flow, the vitality of the community. And that, in short, is an argument for the aesthetics of citizenship. Thank you.
Any discussion of the aesthetics of citizenship requires some sense of who is a citizen and by what terms that status can be found to have an aesthetics. Who's in and who's out? And if aesthetics are taken not as notions of beauty per se, but of what is perceived, what is sensed and sensible, how is citizenship made sensible? According to Immanuel Kant, citizenship is in part affirmed by the right to vote. But in a kind of circular logic, he lists non-citizens by their seemingly natural lack of such a right. Apprentices of merchants, miners, all women, these he classified as passive citizens, and goes on to say that such status contradicts citizenship as such. In the United States, some 85 years later, the Supreme Court ruled against Dred Scott's right to sue for his very freedom after being brought to the North, since the court reasoned that he wasn't a citizen because his parents had been brought from Africa as slaves under the premise that they were of an inferior race. If his parents had been considered less than human by that earlier financial and legal system, it followed Scott himself could not justify himself as a citizen. Geography was trumped by Scott's heredity and the time lag of earlier legal affordances for his slavers. A desperate kind of circular logic had to be devised in order to keep the order of things intact. In some related irony, Paul Virilio has recounted how metal detectors implemented in French maximum security prisons were first deployed in airports, the same technology enabling freedom of movement finding its way to limited. Today, the US has many citizenries contingent on a raft of circular logics, spatial, temporal, but also legal, technological, and moral. Take, for example, the status of the citizen convicted of a crime. What is the space of the criminal? How is it perceived, sensible? What comes of authority, form, and ideology, the terms that used to define incarceration? Michel Foucault opened many eyes on these questions in his familiar essay, Panopticism, in which he described the masterful operation of philosopher Jeremy Bentham's late 18th century invention of a prison, one that relied on new technologies, gaslighting and cast iron structure, on the circular form of its plan, and on his philosophy of surveillance as a basis for moral reform. Foucault famously observed that the building placed the guard psychologically in the mind of every inmate at all times, since no one could ever know whether or not one was watched at any time. But importantly, Foucault begins his essay with a story of how citizens protected one another from plague in an earlier era, outside of a prison context. He recounts, quote, "First, a strict spatial partitioning, the closing of the town and its outlying districts, a prohibition to leave the town on pain of death. Everyone is ordered to stay indoors. It's forbidden to leave on pain of death. Each individual is fixed in his place, and if he moves, he does so at the risk of his life, contagion, or punishment. In short, every citizen body was a potential lethal threat to another, either by plague or punishment. Jailers, the jailed, watchers, and watched, these terms became nearly interchangeable." Just a few years after Bentham's Panopticon, the US saw its first version of the idea take shape, a noticeably different shape, in Philadelphia's Eastern State Penitentiary, or ESP, of 1832. Raphael Sperry, architect and director of the group Architects, Designers, and Planners for Social Responsibility, has pointed out that, quote, "The first prisons in the independent United States were established as penitentiaries to denote their prisoners as religious penitents, serving time for their sins. Accordingly, the radial arms of ESP's architecture provided only solitary confinement as an intended basis for reflection and rehabilitation." Here we can also get a glimpse of the redundant cell walls, blocks, and outer walls that separated criminals from outside society and later the city that grew around it. Today we might have a more challenging time discerning any well-developed ideology, technology, or spatial calculation in the shapes of our prisons, in part because they answer more to invisible site conditions and public-private partnership finances, and because they keep growing more numerous. But we'll come back to this. First, we look to a strange case in which state funding and state representation unexpectedly revolved around the very perception of criminals as citizens. The 1964-65 World's Fair was dedicated to, quote, man's achievement on a shrinking globe in an expanding universe, and its theme was peace through understanding. Here's a plan of the New York State Pavilion, which was comprised of the Tent of Tomorrow, which you see in this kind of eyeball shape, the AstroView observation towers, the plan of which you see here, these three circles, and the so-called Theaterama.
You might know it like this, but a very few people caught a glimpse of it like this. This is the Theaterama, which inside screened a 360-degree panoramic film on New York State. Its exterior facade was plastered with large artworks by famous artists of the day, including Andy Warhol, Roy Lichtenstein, Robert Rauschenberg, and Ellsworth Kelly. The whole production, the buildings and artwork, were intended as a tour de force of state representation and a surround experience that virtually anticipated IMAX today. Robert Moses, then New York City Parks Commissioner, was the corporate president of the fair and took on the project in hopes that its income would support the completion of Flushing Meadows Park. By commissioning Philip Johnson, Governor Rockefeller wanted to showcase New York State as a center for arts and culture, as well as a home for great modern architecture. Not surprisingly, Andy Warhol's contribution, which he entitled 13 Most Wanted Men, was a gesture that pushed many buttons. It literally traded on publicly available imagery already visible in any post office. Here are mugshots of 13 felons that were wanted around the country at the time. But the combination of criminal imagery, the deadpan aestheticization of appropriated imagery, and what was considered by some to be homoerotic undertones made for a Trojan horse of a gift to the fair's organizers. Governor Nelson Rockefeller demanded its covering or removal, and Warhol dutifully painted over the mural a sheet of silver. This would become Warhol's only public art piece, on view for all of 48 hours. One can imagine Warhol's dead-eye reaction to it all, a smug appreciation that the subjects were unwitting and that their photographers were not just remote to his work, but on state payroll. The work was essentially paid for by the state twice. Today we can find other redundancies in the finance and sensibility of incarcerated citizens. CCA, for architects here, not that CCA, is the California, there I am, almost right, is a publicly traded company that describes itself variously in 2008 as, quote, the nation's largest provider of corrections management services to government agencies, or in 2014, as America's largest owner of partnership, correctional, and detention facilities. Keller, we hear you. You might want to mute. In fact, in 2012, CCA was already the largest for-profit private prison company in the country when it sent a letter to 48 state governors offering to buy their public prisons. The catch, CCA offered to buy and operate a state's prison in exchange for a 20-year contract, which would include a 90% occupancy rate guarantee for the entire term, a quota, or else pay the company for unused prison beds. This was considered a low crime tax that essentially penalized taxpayers when prison incarceration rates would fall. No states took CCA up on its offer, but many private prison companies have been successful at inserting occupancy guarantee provisions into prison privatization contracts, requiring states to maintain high occupancy levels in their private prisons. This is one measure by which prison populations in the US are growing, as are prison construction rates, as are occupancy rates, as is privatization of a publicly governed function. Here are some numbers for last century, from 1900 to 2000. It's a little too difficult for you to see, but we move variously from 87 to 478 incarcerated per 100,000 citizens. And you can very clearly see in the graphic the kind of disproportionate concentration of prisons in parts of the country. Or in this graph from the Prison Policy Initiative, we see the trend intensify just since 1980 and how disproportionately it also occurs across the country. Now, the Center for Research on Globalization has recently reported that there are approximately 2 million inmates in state, federal, and private prisons throughout the country. According to California Prison Focus, quote, no other society in human history has imprisoned so many of its own citizens. close quote. 10 years ago, there were only 5 private prisons in the country with a population of 2,000 inmates. Now there are 100 with 62,000 inmates. It is expected by the coming decade the number will hit 360,000, according to reports. All this runs counter to what one might expect, given the advent of ways that prisoners walk, in effect, outside prisons today. Take the Executract 1, the smallest circle inside which a convicted criminal might walk out of the prison's walls. Developed by the BI Corporation, this is a sort of original DNA for a wide range of competing electronic monitoring, or EM products, that now partner private bodies with state and federal probation programs. Use has grown rapidly since the proliferation of broadband internet networks in the mid-1990s. BI describes the ankle-worn device as, quote, GPS you can trust, when you need to know where an offender is or has been with near real-time tracking. BI Executract 1 provides effective offender tracking with both time and financial advantages. Here we see one of their promotional images modeled on a white woman in what seems to be mom jeans, sitting on a park bench. BI writes, Executract 1 combines autonomous GPS, assisted GPS, and AFLT, Advanced Forward Link Trilateration, to create dependable monitoring information. The integration of monitoring systems allows Executract 1 to provide a true location for the supervised person, even in challenging conditions, like when they are indoors, driving, or moving in or between very tall buildings. Importantly, and unlike the GPS we might use to find our way around in a rental car, the device maps, quote, offenders' movements in space, but also in time, able to enforce curfews or to ensure that its subject is moving toward work at an appointed hour, for example. Although journalists have declared this an inside-out panopticon, the object has more subtly overlapping constituencies and spaces at play, circles of influence and jurisdiction. Again, quoting from BI, Executract 1 adds an option of a beacon, currently in the patent approval process. It can be mounted in the offender's home, where the Executract 1 system automatically switches from GPS tracking to radio frequency monitoring. When the person being monitored leaves the beacon's target zone, it instantly reverts to multi-technology GPS tracking. Debates focus on EM's effects on recidivism, its financial merits, its moral aspects, and these are all worthwhile debates. But this switch from radio frequency to GPS also means that the wearer extends their own home or workplace to the space of monitoring. It borrows these spaces for programs that would otherwise be contained within and paid for by the public in publicly administered spaces of monitoring or incarceration. Another redundancy in space and finance, as prison functions are effectively outsourced to the city and to private spaces. The Executract 1, BI goes on, allows officers to draw a precise monitoring zone in any shape through the use of proprietary online maps. Warnings can be sent and officers can create voice messages to send to offenders through the Executract 1 tracking unit, a bidirectional communication system that can be used as an appointment reminder or to alert an offender when they're entering a zone which has been deemed off limits. The GPS unit can build exclusion zones which will alert if an offender goes somewhere they're not allowed to be, like a radius constructed by a restraining order. Alas, as Raphael Sperry predicts, this shows how, quote, EM will reinforce the already existing geography of urban ghettos, what UC Berkeley sociologist Loïc Vacant describes as links between the ghetto and what he calls hyper-incarceration. In Sheboygan County, Wisconsin, as in many municipalities around the country since 1983, over 30 years now, citizens released on probation are outfitted with these EM devices. Former inmates pay a daily fee for wearing these, offloading cost as well to the convicted. If they fail to pay, they can be sent back to prison. If the device is tampered with or removed, that is reported and the wearer returns to prison. Reports show that the hardship of exclusion zones and the cost of paying the fee are often enough to preclude options for earning a living above the poverty line. Further, redundant finances echo around this construction. EM is paid for by taxes, but also by its wearers. Payments are collected by private concerns in and out of the prisons, and also by the local and state prison authorities themselves with whom they partner. As has been reported, this curious logic seeks justification in prisoner reform. Quote, proponents of electronic monitoring hew to a doctrine of personal responsibility. They believe restitution, even to a jailer or taxpayers, is the first step toward recognizing one's misdeeds. Now, it has to be acknowledged that wearable computing and the appearance of EM are nothing new. They're part of a rich history that dates back decades and across numerous fields. In fact, according to media artist Steve Mann, with whom wearable computing and computational photography are practically synonymous, it goes back as far as the 16th century abacus ring. Here we see a series of self-portraits of man with what he calls his digital eyeglasses over the years. As you can see, there are some similarities to things that we've started to see crop up elsewhere in society more recently. Without going further into this history, we can establish that with the ExecuTrack 1, several more recent changes coalesce. At the outer reaches of our planet's skin, we see networks of communications infrastructure increasingly connect with tiny wearable devices under the oceans and in satellite networks. Google Loon, as the project is called, now plans a vast experiment with balloons that can occupy the stratosphere 20 kilometers above the Earth's surface, with the intention of providing broadband internet to anywhere on the planet. Loon's aspiration is to provide connectivity to erase imbalances with poor regions of the world. A loftier goal, perhaps, than our mundane use of GPS devices that connect to satellites in real time for driving navigation. But what exactly is GPS, and how do we use it? To answer this question, we might turn to an online tutorial, for example, on Martha Stewart's website. There's a certain cruel irony to looking at this video where Stewart explains the GPS to her viewers, since she would only grow all too familiar with the technology in short order afterward. After Stewart's conviction for insider trading of ImClone stock, she was briefly incarcerated. When in March 2005 she was released from prison, she had to wear an electronic anklet under house arrest, and this is perhaps the first and most spectacular kind of celebrity anklet spectacle. That September she debuted her daytime TV talk show, displaying her ankle and saying, "I'm unfettered, I am free, no ankle bracelet." And I can note that I was unable to find any image of Stewart actually wearing the anklet. And before we take this too lightly as a spectacle and a case of high-profile privilege, we might look to what has happened since. Just 2 years later, when Lindsay Lohan and several other celebrities were allowing themselves to be constantly photographed wearing the anklet, Karl Lagerfeld opted to embrace the look and created a 2008 series of ankle purses for Chanel, widely derided as tasteless, ringed baubles for what we commonly consider members of inside circles. The gesture nonetheless indicated a withering line between stigma and glamour in the aesthetics of the criminal citizen. Visibility moved in some cases from shame to spectacle, depending variably on things like celebrity and white privilege, and probably most importantly of all, in the ability to opt in. And here things proceed with the escalating popularity of the quantified self movement, with which each new product collects and then diffuses more varied kinds of personal data. These are part of a cultural shift in which we willfully expose our location, our biometrics, pulse, heart rate, calories burned, and more. Maps of a jog might be hard to distinguish from the graphics of an ExecuTrack inclusion zone. Our calendars, our text messages, the locations where it is all registered. This data is wrapped around our limbs and radiated across our personal networks, but also liable to seep onwards to unintended eyes. where exactly tracked data can often be such a deluge as to defy human processing, the quantified self is meant to be interpretable just to us and to those with whom we choose to share. What of the secret, a new kind of wearable, that now prototypes both input and projection of output, all on the flesh of your arm? The top image is a simulation. It's very washed out in the projection, but it's very sharp. These bottom images were released just a few days ago from a working prototype. And this is a kind of also terribly washed out image, but this is a schematic diagram that explains the secret. Under the rubric of entrepreneurship, flesh is every bit the surface of inscription that it has been in incarceration. And while neoliberal economics can be acknowledged as effecting the privatization of schools, of postal services, and of prison services, we see also the ambiguous mix of impulses around penal justice and around the spectacle of private information in the quantified self. Spaces of incarceration continue to shift under varied influences and with contradictory impulses around penal justice. Neoliberalism, the quantified self, infrastructure, are these new terms of citizenship part of what Jacques Rancière has called the distribution of the sensible? Is this now what is meant when we say that there will be no taxation without representation? And are we now set on imprisoning our lost souls and ourselves all in this new aesthetics? Defined as such, the sensible looks like an endless moire pattern of Venn diagrams, concentric and overlapping circles in time and space, extending in scale from our ankle and wrist to the prison walls, the city, and onwards to the stratosphere. Thanks.
Okay. So Keller, I'm going to try and advance your slides here for everyone in the audience, and we'll let you take it away.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks for letting me join you all in this way, and great to hear. Anyway, it's great to be with you. Great to be part of this this gathering. I'm going to offer some thoughts which are less perhaps about the ways in which aesthetics are manifest, or the aesthetics that are manifest in urban space, but the aesthetics in practice that generate them, or the aesthetics in practice for the designer. While manipulation of urban space is often treated as a matter of public policy, with all of its bureaucratic or even deadening consensus, the title of this conference, The Aesthetics of Citizenship, it invites me at least to consider urban protocols in terms of political arts. Historically, our discipline has made so many questionable moves as it intersects with planning, governance, and Hadas has already sort of touched on some of the limits of those. And maybe those questionable moves have sometimes resulted because of design aspirations have tended towards comprehensive prescriptions, in a broad statement. But other registers of form making offer different aesthetic pleasures and political capacities. While architects and urbanists typically design object forms with shape and outline or master plans, sometimes more powerful than designing a thing is designing an interplay between things. When the object of design is an active form that shapes a stream of objects or a population of things, there are the aesthetic pleasures of time-released effects for which there can only be dynamic markers and partial control. An active form can even tune disposition or temperament in organizations, the undeclared or latent potential for productivity or violence in space. So rather than the procedures of planning or policy, can we talk about artistic approaches to making interplay? The aesthetic regimes and practices for making interplay in the material world maybe rely on artistic faculties that exceed language, mathematical construct, scientific proof, bureaucratic consensus, ideology, even political declaration. Maybe they are dispositional, or less about knowing that and more about knowing how. These faculties often even override intellection. They rely on a mind that can model potentials in time, a correlative mind that knows how to translate between languages and ranges of information. It's a mind capable of working through a changing, unfinished process for which there can only be dynamic markers. Maybe it's something like the mind of a chess master, except that the games can't be rationalized and the irrationalities have to be modulated improvisationally. So it's a mind maybe that trumps game theory with a knowledge of confidence games. It's a mind that works with indeterminacy to be practical, however ironic that may appear to be. One can, for instance, only know how to navigate a river by observing ripples and dimples on the surface. One can only know how to correlate card combinations in poker against the changing faces of the player, know how to feel for the potentials of bread and dough, land a plane in high wind, sling plaster, hustle, kiss, or tell a joke. There are architects who know how. They have mental faculties that allow them to walk over a field and subsequently draw the topographic map or predict the size of an upstairs bedroom in relation to an interest rate. Hyper-aware of multiple levers and faders in urban space, they might think of changing a street by increasing the number of times a train stops there. They can mentally model the way a tax structure will eviscerate a city, or the way a toxic building will topple all the buildings around it. Rather than a master plan for a city, they design a growth protocol with counterbalancing calculus of public and private space. They imagine collapsing the morphology of airports by reconceptualizing the departure lounge within it. You know what I'm talking about. They adjust the capacities of an entire highway network by altering the repertoire of one switch within it. They initiate a long-term process for organizing the forests and vantage points of a mountain range. They deliberately craft a seductive, cultural, non-spatial story or persuasion to have explicit spatial consequences. They change suburban morphology by designing a detail that becomes contagious within a population of houses. Or like a comedian who learned to tell jokes to keep his parents from fighting, an architect might even know how to deftly deploy spatial variables to reduce the violence of binaries or dissipate monistic concentrations of authority. But I see more and more architects picking up these tools like these, deploying spatial variables in interplay, an interplay that managed to dislodge municipal instruments like taxes and so on, previously thought to be under the purview of policy. So this is going to slide 4 now. I've long studied, and you may have to. I've long studied one of the world's most robust examples of an urban formless financial instrument, the free zone. And a couple of years ago, a Dutch TV show came to me because they were trying to demonstrate what a tax haven looked like. And of course, it looks like everything from a shack with a server in it to a city with buildings that look like diamonds and dolphins. The free zone establishes legal authorities exempt from the laws of the host country. It grants tax exemptions, allows for foreign ownership of property, provides cheap labor, and deregulates environmental and labor laws. It's a relatively dumb enclave form that produces suboptimal economic results, and no one even really knows why we're using it, except that it delivers a contagious form of incentivized urbanism to which the world's become addicted. Over the last 30 years, it's mutated from warehouse compound to mega city, as every program for businesses, residential, cultural resort want to enjoy its lubricated political quarantine. The zone is a perfect island of corporate externalizing that has now become the germ of the city building epidemic. Something that, there were a handful of zones in the world in the 1960s. Today there are thousands in 130 countries. resources away from host countries in return for inferior jobs for which there is little or no protection or oversight. As remote controls, they also siphon tax dollars away from every country in the world, from Buffalo, New York, and draw large migrations of labor to countries where that labor neither possesses nor wants its citizenship. If the power of interplay is leverage, the zone incentive leverages very little for anyone but private commercial organizations. Still, Washington consensus global consultancies treat it like the shibboleth for entry into the global marketplace. But the aesthetics of interplay that are so different from planning or policy might find great advantage in gaming the pile-up of beautiful irrationalities that surround the zone. This inferior financial instrument not only inspires nearly every country in the world to spend millions of dollars to build a mirror-tiled skyline. You're looking at one that was supposed to be built on a swamp, on the shores of the Black Sea. So it not only inspires this incredible, irrational expenditure, but even better, many aspire to be called a city. Go to the next slide. We can take advantage of the fact that the zone is a contagious platform. We can design something to multiply within the zone and potentially change it as radically as it's changed over the last 30 years. And given the zone's ambition to be a city, maybe it even unwittingly carries the genetics of its own reversal or antidote. One way to hack the zone is to map selected zone incentives onto existing cities rather than the greenfield urban enclaves that they usually are. In other words, return the zone to the rule of law. And finally, more directly return financial benefits to the domestic economy. You can go to the next slide. So rather than giving away national assets in exchange for the zone, a more transparent bargain with foreign investment uses the city as the other half of an interplay that leverages more infrastructure and resources. Nairobi places incentives and interplay with transit, for instance, or Guadalajara or Moscow or Quito, each leverage in interplay according to their needs. The next countries in line to adopt the zone might surprise the global consultancies and financial institutions that are pushing the form in its current state. They might proudly offer economic incentives as well as the symbolic capital that attends higher labor and environmental standards. It's a simple idea that becomes powerful if it's positioned to become a multiplier within a population of zones. It's a difference between designing a master plan and exploiting a contagion. You can go to the next slide. And we could go to another scale. We've all long been looking at the house as a financial instrument. And the next slide. In the wake of the 2008 financial crisis in Rust Belt cities and ghost suburbs across the U.S., cities like Buffalo, the failure was so spectacular, the financial failure was so spectacular, that kind of magic happened. Many properties ceased to be traffic mortgage products and returned to being physical houses, no longer standing for money. They returned to the gravitational field. Next slide. Mold grew in the pools. Taxes were due. The banks were somehow happier to settle with a municipality. And land banks have been one organ for sort of resetting the house, allowing it to, by going underwater, duck out from under a financial abstraction to become a physical, durable object again, to be resold or reaggregated for use by citizens and cities in something almost like a parallel market of spatial variables, pardon me, rather than financial variables. So with the aesthetic of interplay, an architect is sort of pushing the play button on the dispositif, as Foucault described, or animating the dispositif to become dispositional act. So an architect who knows how might see a chance to not only put the development machine into forward, but in this case also put it into reverse. Active forms that direct the subtraction or contraction of development might be very useful in many parts of the world, from distended suburbs to coastal floodplains to sensitive environmental landscapes. Go to the next slide. We can even trade, negotiate, and revalue vacancy. All these things are part of an alternative value, portfolio of values, with more tangible rewards and safeguards against risk than those provided by financial instruments alone. We see that in Buffalo, just as we can see it in Youngstown, Ohio, that you're looking at here, and its projected plans for creative shrinkage that you see in the next slide. Now, the next slide, a city like Savannah established a growth protocol with an interplay of public and private quotients of land. Next slide. An interplay like Savannah in reverse, or a reverse game of Go, might be a subtraction protocol that considers how to shrink, contract, or target development by designing an interplay between counterbalancing properties that may even be remote from each other. Next slide. The game might play out through a number of simple moves, beginning with the standing gamble that densification increases value of municipal tax revenue. By considering a counterbalancing interdependency between lots, a city with a plan to densify and consolidate development can designate increased revenues from a number of these moves to purchase remote lots. Next slide. To incentivize property improvement, the city grants micro-shares or micro-bonds related to the new cleared and reconstituted property. Next. Shares add value to the building portfolios of densifying properties, but they're also extra compensation for the previous owners of the cleared property, compensation that maintains their presence as stakeholders in the city. So again, by thinking of two properties in interdependence, nothing can ever be worth nothing. Next slide. So step by step, like a ratchet that works against an immovable weight, the active forms of subtraction protocol might allow properties to be relieved, reorganized, reaggregated. Next slide. Gradually, as the purchase of remote lots becomes routine, as the city acquires contiguous properties, it begins to assemble larger parcels with the potential for other urban functions. Newly aggregated, the property may have even gained in value. Next slide. Cities need land for a number of enterprises, and significant parcels of land are often difficult to acquire from individual sellers. Might these remote lots help to overcome some of those obstacles? Next slide. So once assembled for a new enterprise, the owners of microshares or microbonds begin to receive dividends from enterprises. A microshare that early in the game might have seemed worthless may eventually be worth quite a lot. The site may produce revenues from some new enterprise or revenues from increased property values related to being on the edge of the clearing. In this game of Go, well, it's not making walls, but making clearings, and so the strategizing is about being on the edge of those clearings without destroying them. All shareholders have an offset or a hedge against further real estate perils, since owners have interest not only in their own lot, but also in a diversified portfolio of lots with complementary but different programs. For banks, the protocol generates business and stabilizes loans previously in default. Since the shares are issued at a moment when the value of property is near zero, there's little risk of exposure due to lost value, but there might be an incentive to be stewards of infrastructure space. An apparent twist on so that then if one's starting to rehearse these kinds of aesthetics of interplay, an apparent twist on the usual notion we see an apparent twist on the usual notion of the home as autonomous entity, where interdependencies may make the house both more stable and more financially independent. Next slide. In places like ghost suburbs and rust belts and floodplains, in Detroit's and New Orleans of our country, a lot of beleaguered city officials are left to say, quote unquote, the financials don't work. But maybe that fact is the opening for an architect designing interplay in a parallel market of spatial variables. Think about on the coastal floodplains. Maybe an entrepreneurial effort imagine an entrepreneurial effort to create a property exchange focused on an interplay between properties. an information-rich index with the benefit of intelligence from urbanists and landscape architects and regional environmentalists, could target and rate properties for their complementary risks and benefits, or their counterbalancing attributes. In other words, like a matchmaking website, the exchange could then rate not only properties themselves, but the benefits of changing use or swapping positions in an urban regional landscape. It rates or certifies mortgage transactions that result in an advantageous relocation or consolidation of property with reduced collective risk for all. So the more advantageous the swap, the higher the rating. A shoreline owner moves to higher ground. A year-round coastal property becomes a seasonal vacational property. A municipality is able to aggregate land for levees or revetments or dunes or sand replenishing programs. A clearing adds value to a denser property on its perimeter by providing views and water retention. In any of these transactions, since the trade itself is worth a quotient of flood insurance, and since it becomes an increasingly viable mortgage, the exchange draws investment from insurance companies. Both institutions also incentivize the transaction with lower rates and streamlined deals. So these are the kinds of poker games or confidence games that another aesthetics of interplay might imagine. Next slide. So finally, if we are considering the aesthetics of the politics of interplay, more than knowing that, in other words, more than knowing what to righteously oppose, we might work on how to oppose it. The rational, the resolute, the righteous are cornerstones of dissent, sometimes, but they're sometimes less consequential than the discrepant and the fictional and the sly. In a world where there are dynamic markers, uncertainty doesn't prevent us from action. Instead, it's the stuff of a more finely grained, stealthy political world where an ability to follow the indeterminate is not only more practical, but more vigilant. So might the aesthetics of interplay, deployed with any number of spatial, material, and immaterial forms, support the design of a snaking chain of moves that can worm into and gradually leverage against intractable politics. Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Keller, we have you on 6 screens tiled up here, so kind of no swapping around. So we have, it's almost 4, which was going to mark our break, but I would like to open it up to questions and comments from the audience for anyone, any of us, if there are any. And if they're not, I would like to maybe pose one question and try and see if I can address some of the common themes, which are about ownership and control that I think all of the presentations touched on to at least a certain extent. The idea that there's a spiraling ring of control from the home and the city down to the ankle bracelet, and then back out, if we look at Keller's, to a mode of uncontrol, where trying to create alternative markets, I believe what Keller named parallel markets of spatial variables. And so I think that this question of ownership and control has perhaps not a dialectic in and of itself, but, and I'm not sure if I have a really clearly articulated question in that, but I think that if we look back at Hadas's presentation, the notion that you provide ownership in the terms of a home, and that you, in return, there is some sort of, maybe not control, as a pessimistic way to label it, but at least the idea of a new citizen. And so maybe I'll ask a very broad question about the relationship between notions of property ownership, home ownership, and the idea of control and what that means within a state, what that means within a city, and in all of these cases, whether it's in a zone or a Detroit or a prison, what that means as a kind of political being or a subject.
Is that open to anyone to?
Yeah, go for it.
Well, I was struck by some kind of flip side between the citizen's intent, as Hadas so wonderfully described it, and a little bit what I see in some designers as they're working now with spatial variables in a different way. Perhaps different from designing the signals, spatial visual signals of reinforcing signals of citizenship that we find from the threshold all the way to the city or the region. And the difference between that and designing mechanisms by which citizens themselves might generate those things. And in some ways it sounds as if the Smithsons are in every way somewhere between designing the kind of visual signals, the kind of the aesthetics of the world that is experienced, and something more like the aesthetics of practices between citizens. I don't know if that contributes anything.
Well, I think, I'm not trying to force analogies between unit logs, but you can't hear? Can you hear now? Can you hear now? Keller, can you hear me? No.
I can't quite hear you very well.
Okay, I don't know how this is on.
Just have to speak loud.
Okay, why don't I just speak in my regular voice? So I was thinking about the connection between what you said at the beginning of your talk about the spaces in between. And I think, though, of course, there's a huge difference between private ownership and what the Smithsons were imagining. I mean, no one would actually own those properties that they were designing, but the state. There's an interest in the interstitial spaces that at which citizenship occurs or connections occur that ultimately lead to a multi-layered condition of being a member of society, I suppose is the way they would see it. And I thought that was interesting, the threshold conditions that are so important in their way of thinking about the new citizen, the post-war citizen, and what you're describing in contemporary conditions.
Both of those would be at sort of, for lack of a better term, it's sort of an outside, right? A threshold, an interstitial space, or something that's beyond, that kind of subsumes the market or something. It's something that's kind of outside of those formal regulations. Is that
And it is.
fair?
I mean, the Smithsons, as the example that we're using here, just didn't really have a style. I mean, they were accused of that numerous times. They didn't actually produce buildings in a specific style. So they didn't have what normally we think of as an aesthetic that belongs to a practice. And I think it's related to this kind of rationale.
Well, I would just, I don't have much to add to that. I don't know, is this operating at all? But I think that this may be stating the obvious, but it's very striking to me how this exact theme plays out in changing status of matter and of making versus unmaking, or as Keller has been talking about it, if I'm getting you right, you're referring to this work on subtraction. Is that right?
Yes.
So I think that vis-a-vis Hadas's points about brutalism's relationship to the ordinary and banal and the ugly and the kind of housing, and this astonishing statistic of 74% government-built housing. It just is all in such stark contrast to the terms, well, maybe the kind of influences that may be turned a little bit on their head as I'm hearing Keller talk about it, but also this kind of changed status of making versus unmaking, and kind of observing the possible symbiosis between empty lots and lots that start to densify in a city. And maybe that has some kind of loose relationship to some uneasy relationship to built architecture in the talk that I was trying to share.
Well, thinks about, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
So say one thinks about the ways in which the houses that have long been financial instruments have been dressed up with other aesthetics about citizenship, whether to sort of signal some other relationship about citizenship, that, you know, that the mid-century house had already become a mortgage product, but was dressed up to be a symbol of citizenship, patriotism, so on. And so in some ways to think about that mortgage system having failed so spectacularly, that there's another aesthetic register that can be activated, where one's actually trading in the portfolio of the stuff of one's house, outside of the sort of very volatile financial envelope that's surrounding it. And that has been, I think, one of the beauties of the post-2008 moment, maybe like the sort of post-war moment, a moment where there's some other register of space making becomes available, some other aesthetic regime.
I mean, it's a very optimistic kind of ending note that started as a very optimistic beginning note of architects, trained architects, being given the opportunity to design a new London, a new Britain, and now taking a step back and looking at the material of architecture and looking back at practice on how that can again propose an alternative to things such as mortgage products and all of these sort of economic devices that that we have to operate within. And so, again, maybe not much of a question, but maybe that's a good place to stop it for this session on an upbeat note, which is always good. So thank you to Hadas, and of course to Keller for Skyping in. This worked much more smoothly than it